Today, when most of us feel cold during the winter months, we either turn on the heat or put on a thick coat. Yet, during the American Revolutionary War, a large portion of the soldiers fighting in the freezing cold had to make do with just a single blanket. So, was this really possible? Could they have endured that cold with just a single blanket? They didn't have the option of turning on the heat or wearing thick clothing like we do today. In fact, most of them didn't even have a proper coat. Despite this, they tried to sleep on the snow with just a thin blanket. Unfortunately, some of them succumbed to the cold, but a large number of them managed to open their eyes the next morning, despite all the hardships. So, how did they do it? How were they able to survive? The answer wasn't that they were lucky or more resilient than others. They were people who had learned how to fight the cold. They knew how to conserve their body heat, why frozen ground was dangerous, and how even the people right next to them played a crucial role in their survival. If you enjoy discovering little-known events from history, you can subscribe to the channel. Now, let's take a look together at how these soldiers survived those freezing winter nights with just a single blanket. Let us begin by correcting something almost everyone gets wrong. When you picture a soldier trying to stay warm, you probably think first about his coat. But for a Continental soldier in winter, the single most important object he owned was not his coat. It was his blanket. This is hard for us to grasp because we think of a blanket as something that lives on a bed and stays there. For an 18th century soldier, the blanket was the center of his entire survival. It was his coat when he marched, wrapped around his shoulders against the wind. It was his bed when he slept, the only thing between his body and the frozen ground. It was his shelter when there was no shelter, the roof and walls of a man lying in the open. One rectangle of wool did the work of a coat, a mattress, and a tent all at once, which is why the loss of a blanket was a catastrophe, and why the Army worried about blankets almost as much as it worried about food and shoes. A man without a blanket in winter was a man with no way to keep his body heat through the night, and a man who cannot stay warm at night cannot recover, cannot rest, and cannot fight. The blanket was not a comfort item. It was life support. And the terrible reality of the Continental Army was that there were never enough of them. Blankets, like everything else, were in chronic short supply. Men shared them, wore them to rags, and died for the lack of them. So the real question is a practical one. Given one thin wool blanket, often no proper coat, and a winter that could kill, how did a soldier actually keep himself alive through the night? The answer is a matter of physics, ingenuity, and the human body itself. To understand how a soldier survived the cold, you first have to understand how the cold kills, because everything the soldier did was a response to the particular ways a body loses heat. The human body is a furnace that burns food to hold itself at a steady temperature. In the cold, that heat constantly escapes, and it escapes through several distinct paths. It radiates off exposed skin into the air. It conducts away wherever the body touches something cold, which is why lying directly on frozen ground drains heat so fast. It is carried off by moving air, the wind stripping warmth from the body far faster than still air. And it is lost through evaporation, as sweat and damp pull heat away when they dry. Every one of these paths had to be blocked, and each required a different trick. Radiation and conduction were fought with insulation, with layers of material that trapped air and slowed the escape of heat. The wind was fought with barriers, anything that could break the moving air before it reached the skin. And evaporation was fought by staying dry, which in a winter camp was the hardest battle of all, because wet was everywhere, and a wet man was a dying man. This is the crucial point the soldiers understood through hard experience, even without the science to explain it. Wet destroys the ability of insulation to work. Wool holds warmth when dry, but a soaked blanket conducts heat away from the body almost as fast as bare skin. So survival was not only about having enough material, it was about keeping that material dry and understanding in a practical bodily way how the heat was leaking out and how to stop it. If the blanket was the center of survival, then the material it was made of was the reason survival was possible at all. That material was wool, and wool was not chosen by accident. Wool has a property that made it irreplaceable in the 18th century, and that still makes it valuable today. Its fibers are naturally crimped and springy, which means a woolen cloth is full of tiny pockets of trapped air. Since still air is one of the best insulators there is, this trapped air is what holds a body's heat in. A good thick wool blanket works by surrounding a man with a layer of warmed, motionless air held in place by the fibers. But the truly vital property of wool is what it does when wet, and this is where it beats almost every other material available at the time. When wool gets damp, it still retains much of its insulating power, because the structure of the fiber keeps holding air, even when water is present. A wet wool blanket is miserable, but it will still keep a man alive. The same blanket made of linen or cotton, once soaked, would be a death sentence, holding no warmth at all. This is why armies of the age were built around wool. The coats, when men had them, were wool. The blankets were wool. The stockings and the breeches were wool. In a damp, cold, wet winter world, with no waterproof synthetic materials, wool was the one thing that stood between a soldier and death. The material that kept working when everything got wet, as it always eventually did. And it explains why the shortage of wool blankets was so deadly. It was not simply a shortage of bedding. It was a shortage of the one substance that could reliably hold a man's heat through a wet, freezing night. And there was no adequate substitute for it. Given the blanket and whatever else he had, the soldier's survival came down to how he used it. And this was a genuine skill, learned through cold, miserable nights, that separated the men who suffered from the men who did not wake up. The first principle was layering. A single thick covering is far less effective than several thinner layers, because each gap between layers traps its own pocket of insulating air. A soldier who could put a shirt, a waistcoat, a coat if he had one, and then a blanket between himself and the cold was building a series of air pockets, each one slowing the escape of heat. Men layered everything they had, and a man with two thin garments could sometimes stay warmer than a man with one thick one, if he understood how to trap the air between them. The second principle was covering the extremities and the head. A great deal of heat is lost from the head, the hands, and the feet. And a soldier who wrapped a scrap of cloth around his head and hands could hold far more of his core warmth than one who left them bare. This is why you see the improvised head wrappings and the constant effort to leave as little skin exposed as possible. The third principle was getting off the ground. Lying directly on frozen earth drains, heat through conduction faster than almost anything else. So a soldier who could put anything between himself and the ground, straw, brush, a layer of wood, even a second man, would lose far less warmth than one lying on bare, cold soil. The straw that the army worked so hard to supply was not a comfort. It was insulation between the sleeping body and the deadly cold of the ground. And the fourth principle was wrapping to seal the air in. A blanket simply draped over a man leaves gaps at every edge where warm air escapes and cold air enters. A blanket wrapped and tucked tightly around the body, sealing the neck, the feet, and the sides, holds the warmed air against the skin. The difference between a draped blanket and a properly wrapped one could be the difference between shivering through the night and freezing in it. There was one more resource available to the freezing soldier, and it was the most important of all, and also the most human. It was each other. Shared body heat is one of the most effective survival tools there is, and the soldiers used it constantly. Two men sharing two blankets, doubled and wrapped around them both, were dramatically warmer than two men each huddled alone under one. By combining their coverings and pressing their bodies together, they pooled their heat and cut the surface area exposed to the cold. 3 or 4 men together, sharing all their blankets and lying close, could survive nights that would have killed any one of them alone. This is why the crowded huts, for all the disease they bred, also kept men alive. A dozen men packed into a small log cabin were each radiating heat, and together they raised the temperature of the whole space, warming the air with their own bodies. The very crowding that spread sickness was also, in the brutal arithmetic of the winter, part of how they survived the cold. It was a devil's bargain, warmth traded against contagion, and the men had no choice but to take it. On the march and in the open, men slept in piles, deliberately, wrapping their combined blankets over the group and sharing the warmth of the bodies at the center. There was nothing romantic about it. It was survival reduced to its simplest form, a group of freezing men keeping each other alive with the only reliable heat they had, the warmth of their own bodies pressed together. And it points to something true about survival in extremity. The soldier did not endure the winter as an individual with a blanket. He endured it as part of a group that shared everything, warmth included, because alone, with one blanket and no coat, a man very often could not survive at all. Together, they could. No account of staying warm would be complete without fire, which was both the soldier's greatest ally and a far more limited one than we tend to imagine. Fire was the obvious source of warmth, and the camps were full of it. Campfires burned constantly, and men gathered around them at every opportunity, warming their hands and their fronts and drying their damp clothing. A fire was a gathering point, a source of cooked food, and a genuine source of heat. And the endless labor of gathering firewood was one of the central tasks of camp life, precisely because fire mattered so much. But fire has serious limits as a way to survive a winter, and the soldiers ran into all of them. A fire only warms one side of you at a time, so a man toasting his front froze his back. It only works while you are near it and awake to tend it, which is no help through the long hours of sleep when the cold is deadliest. It demands a constant supply of wood, and the area around a large camp was quickly stripped of anything that would burn. And an open fire cannot be brought into a small wooden hut full of men without filling it with choking smoke. So fire warmed the waking hours and dried the clothing and cooked the food, but it could not carry a man through the night. When the fire burned low and the men lay down to sleep, they were thrown back on the blanket, the layers, the straw, and each other. Fire was the warmth of the day and the evening. Survival through the frozen night depended on everything else. This is a distinction the soldiers understood well. The dangerous hours were not the ones spent around the fire. They were the dark, sleeping hours when the fire could not help, when a man's life depended entirely on how well he had wrapped himself, and how close he lay to the men beside him. For all their skill and all their improvisation, sometimes the cold won, and it is worth understanding honestly what that meant, because it is both less dramatic and more disturbing than the popular image. Freezing to death is a quiet process. As the body loses heat faster than it can produce it, its core temperature begins to fall, and the effects come in stages. First comes violent shivering, the body's desperate attempt to generate heat through muscle activity. Then, as the cold deepens, the shivering can stop, which seems like relief but is actually a dangerous sign that the body is losing the fight. Thinking becomes slow and confused. Movements become clumsy. And in the final stages, a strange calm and drowsiness sets in, and the person simply slips into unconsciousness and does not wake. This is why the cold was so insidious. It did not feel at the end like a violent death. A man overcome by cold in his sleep often simply did not wake in the morning, and his companions would find him still and quiet, having died without a struggle in the hours before dawn. There was no drama to it, no final stand. There was a man who lay down cold and did not get up. And it did not always kill outright. The cold maimed as often as it killed. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses damaged by the cold could be permanently lost, and men were left crippled by winters they had survived, carrying the marks for the rest of their lives. This was the enemy the blanket stood against. Not discomfort, but this quiet, creeping, permanent damage, and the silent deaths in the dark that a single thin piece of wool was, incredibly, often all that prevented. So return, finally, to the soldier with his one blanket and no coat, and consider what his survival actually represented. It represented an enormous amount of accumulated skill applied to a desperate problem. He had learned, through nights of misery, how to layer what little he had, how to keep it dry, how to wrap himself so the warmth stayed in, how to get off the frozen ground, how to share the heat of other bodies, how to use the fire while it helped and rely on everything else when it could not. Survival with one blanket was not luck. It was a hard-won, practical mastery of the cold, learned at terrible cost. And it represented, once again, the reality that the war was won in these unglamorous margins. Not only in the battles, but in the countless freezing nights survived, in the men who wrapped themselves in a single blanket and lived to march another day. Every soldier who made it through a winter night was a soldier still in the army the next morning, and the survival of the army through those winters was the survival of the cause itself. It is worth sitting with the sheer thinness of the margin. One blanket, often no coat, a body, some wool, some straw, a fire that helped for part of the day, and the warmth of the men lying next to you. That was the whole of it, the entire apparatus standing between a soldier and a quiet death in the dark. That men survived winter after winter on so little is a testament not to their equipment, which was pitifully inadequate, but to their skill and their endurance. The soldier with one blanket and no coat did not survive because the winter was kind. He survived because he had learned, the hardest way there is, how to wring every possible degree of warmth out of almost nothing. And then he got up in the morning and did it all again. Today, almost all of us move to a warmer place or put on thicker clothes when we feel cold. But back then, those soldiers didn't have that option. It wasn't thicker blankets or better clothing that kept them alive. They knew how to make the most of the limited resources they had under harsh conditions. Perhaps that's why one of the greatest battles of the American Revolutionary War wasn't fought against the enemy, but against the freezing cold that set in every night. Now, I'd like to ask you a question. If you were in their shoes, with only a thin blanket and a few soldiers around you, could you have survived that freezing winter night until morning?